All right. So, my apologies. Oh, all right. So, I want to take the time to introduce myself. My name is Emmanuel Morales, also known as Manny. I am the youth organizer with North Bay Organizing Project. Through my line of work, I get to meet with students, meet with student-led organizations on your independent clubs in your respective schools. And at the same time, I get to facilitate what's known as the Latinx Student Congress, which allows me to work directly with the clubs, be able to network, invite y'all in to events that we have going on, and also use the space as a network for the students to be able to network in, to meet with other clubs that are meeting on their respective campuses, and to have that ongoing support, so that when you have something going on your campus and you need donations, you need turnout, then you can reach out to the other clubs and to get that type of support. And vice versa, they can also inform you on what's going on and reach out for support when it's necessary. So let's see. So yeah, so the topic today is gonna be speaking on or touching on culture and identity, and I'm gonna do it through the lens of the low-riding car culture. This car culture that originated as a subculture of the Chicano community that has now become this global phenomenon. And so through this conversation, you'll get to hear a little bit of the historical context and how it relates to culture and identity. So I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the sociology component to this art form. So I'm going to exit just for a minute and just make sure that I was actually not sharing my screen. So yeah, so here we are. Low riding our culture, our identity. So thank you all for sitting in. Let's see, we still have folks joining us. So welcome y'all. Again, my name is Manny Emmanuel Morales, youth organizer with NBOP, and I'll be talking about low riding. So actually, before I go to this part, I know that it looks like one of the classes has the youth that are observing this presentation on your projector screen. But for those of you that have access to your laptop, that you're viewing this on your laptop and you're able to access the let's see, the chat, if you can put in maybe some of the things that you observed during the music video that was played beforehand. And if you're part of the class that's viewing this on the projector, you can also turn on mic maybe and maybe have some of the youth that were able to watch the video share what's something that stood out during the music video, what visually, maybe lyrically, maybe the music, the beat itself. What are some of the things that stood out? Because we're kind of gonna break things down in a way that relates to the way that this this music video was presented. So anybody can turn on mic and you can share like what stood out. If you'd like to type it in the chat, you can type it in the chat.
My students have never seen that video and have never heard that song.
Oh, okay.
So that was interesting to me. I thought they would know it.
Did anyone recognize the musicians, the rap artists that created that video? Is anybody familiar? Is anyone familiar with Cypress Hill? You can raise your hand if you're familiar with Cypress Hill. Yeah, or type it in the chat if you'd like. Yeah, so yeah, for those of you that might have joined us after, I showed a video at the beginning of the presentation called Lowrider by Cypress Hill. Cypress Hill is a Los Angeles-based rap group that became extra popular in the mid 90s, early 90s actually, and have since then continue this trajectory into like just being a world-renowned music group. And so the setup of the music video, if you might have noticed, it begins with a car cruising, several individuals in that car. I think many of them, or if not all of them, might have been members of the rap group Cypress Hill. Sometimes in music videos, you might notice like this random person kind of sitting in the back. A lot of the times that's the actual car owner. When they're lending the car for a music video, they might just have the actual owner in the back seat, kind of as a like a cameo. They sort of make this cameo. So if you're familiar with the car, if you're familiar with the car owner, you might recognize them that way. But I'll try to play it at the end of the presentation as well for those of you that might have missed it. But yeah, then eventually it moves into like starting to break down and show kind of like a different eras of the lowrider scene. And so that's something that I'm going to be speaking about, is breaking down the historical origins of lowriding, of this car culture, and what it meant, especially for the times in which they were it's associated to, right? So yeah, so without further ado, yeah, I can speak on just my perspective. This is not anything official. It's just I can speak on my perspective on the sideshows. I know that that's a topic, one of the main topics in our community right now when it comes to taking care of our streets, but also safety, right? So I'll touch upon that. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, so I'm going to begin to break down the historical context by speaking about the origins of the lowrider culture. And so I'm going to take y'all back to kind of the beginning stages of this movement, right? The 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. This cultural art form really took hold in the southwestern states of the United States, including California, Arizona, Nuevo Mexico, Texas, Colorado. And in those states, there was a large population of folks that were considered to be Mexican Americans, Mexicans, immigrants, and folks of color in general, right? But during those times, when we consider, what racism meant at the time and the laws that were in place that perpetuated the sentiment of racism, folks of color, folks of immigrant background were treated as second-class citizens. And just like the United States South, what would be Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas even, right? Some of the southern states practice segregation. It was the same here in the southwestern states, including California, where bathrooms, facilities, buildings were accessible to some and inaccessible to others based on quote unquote their race, ethnicity, cultural background, place of origin, things of that sort. During this time, as a result of the this racist sentiment. An event happened in the 1930s that were a direct cause of the Great Depression, right? When as y'all, most of you, I'm assuming are high school students that are present here. In the 1930s, the United States went through an economic recession known as the Great Depression, where many people lost their jobs. There was a lot of poverty as a result of that. The credit system was faulted, and the general, I guess, society started to seek out who would be scapegoated, and meaning, that the blame was placed on them for what had happened in the United States, similar to what happened not too long ago in 2008, with the economic recession and people losing their homes, losing their jobs. It was very similar back then, if not at a greater, I guess, extent. And as a result of that, again, the quote unquote minorities were scapegoated as being at the root of the cause for the U.S. economy to fall. So what ended up happening is that in the 1930s, they repatriated many of the folks that were self-identified as Mexican, or in general identified as Mexican American. Repatriated meaning deported. They were sent back to their home countries. Many of them actually being United States citizens. And this process, this mass deportation event that happened, is also depicted in the movie Mi Familia. If y'all have ever seen the movie Mi Familia, Jennifer Lopez is one of the main characters, who depicts the matriarch of a family who during the 1930s gets deported. She is rounded up in Los Angeles, placed on a train and sent back to Mexico, where then she has to make the journey back to the United States to be with her family, right? To join her family again. And then, all the trauma that happens after that. Some of the prevalent identity terms were folks that identified as Mexican American, Chicanos, Chicanas, and Pachucos. So if you notice the pictures that I'm showing you here, the Pachuco style, known as the Susu style, was one of the main, or the most popular trend amongst the Chicano youth. This was a style that was borrowed from the African American youth, especially in Harlem, New York, where it was kind of like the subculture. The young people, this is what they wore, this is what they did when they went out clubbing, to concerts, things of that sort. And so this is a borrowed style that came from the African American community, the Black community. Chicanos then adopted it, and it became known as the Pachuco style. But due to criminalization, their attire often associated them with being young and being a criminal, and they were targeted by police. The top right picture depicts what is referred to as the Susu riots that happened in Los Angeles in 1943. And it's very important to understand the context behind the name of this violent incident. It was deemed the Susu riots almost as if they were placing blame, if not directly placing blame, on the Chicano youth that identified as a Pachuco. The story behind this incident that started when Navy men that came back from World War II were in LA, in the downtown area, were at a bar, and because of that racist sentiment, began to violently target Chicano youth, and ended up fighting with them, but also stripping them of their clothes and leaving them in the sidewalks to be humiliated. And so the police responded, and the police targeted the Pachucos. They still saw them as being at fault for this incident, and as a result, the mass media went on to call this and refer to this incident as the Suzu riots. And so it's important to understand these things, because when incidents like this happen, and you know that at the root of the issue is violence that's being perpetuated due to racist sentiment, why not call it the Navy Men riot, or the call it for what it is, rather than placing blame, again, scapegoating the community. During this time, when we start to talk about like what the car culture was like and how it was connected to this cultural identity, the young people began to modify the cars. The cars typically belonged to the parents, because at this time it was expensive to own a car. And so the young people didn't necessarily have their own car to customize. So when they borrowed their parents' car, they would typically lower it. And so this became sort of this counterculture to what was already happening in the US, which was the hot rod car culture. The hot rod car culture focused a lot on performance, specifically drag racing. And so for that reason, the cars were modified in a way that they sort of pointed, well, not sort of, they actually pointed downward for aerodynamics. The Chicano youth, again, in an effort to be different, to be counterculture, they modified them in a way that they would lower the car to give it a distinct look, and also most often like lower the back end of it and allow the front end to sit a little bit higher, for that aesthetic, to give it that look that was it looked different. It looked like opposite of what a hot rod was. During this time, again, due to the high cost of owning a car, it was all about affordability and style. So when they lowered a car, and they didn't do anything that would permanently keep the car lowered, what they did was put either sandbags, concrete bags, or bricks in the trunks to lower the car in the back, to squeeze the back end coils of the car. And then at the end of the night, when they returned their car to their parents, they could then just take out, the sandbags or the concrete bags, and have the car back to stock height. And so that was their way of modifying the suspension. It was simply just to put enough weight on the car to lower it and be able to take it out when necessary. At the core of the Chicano culture during this time, some of the most I guess prevalent like principles and philosophies were around family, respect, and honor. All right, and moving on to the second era. This is what I consider, again, if we break it down in terms of eras, the 1930s, 40s, and 50s were sort of the origins of the lowrider car culture in the Chicano community. The next era that I want to speak on is what I refer to as La Causa, right? The 1960s and 70s, when young Chicanos were organizing in the educational setting, but they were also organizing in the community around civil rights, student rights, similar to what was happening, and a lot of the times in alignment with what was happening in the African American community and Black community with the movement for civil rights. The same was going on in the Chicano community, and a lot of it was rooted around the same issues of of racism, segregation, inequality, and things of that sort. So during the civil rights era, the discrimination persisted. The neighborhoods were still being redlined. They're still being discriminated against when it came to home ownership, to access to resources, to schools that the young people could attend. And police brutality was also very prevalent around this time. The abuse of power, especially when it came to addressing youth in the community who were protesting these injustices. So in an effort to unify the communities, at the same time that Dr. Martin Luther King was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, and Cesar Chavez was organizing, and Dolores Huerta were organizing, amongst others, including our Filipino brothers and sisters, like Larry Elong. They were organizing the agricultural workers. They were starting to unify the movements, right? And so the Chicano youth were doing the same, aligning themselves with the African American and Black movements. So one of these pictures, you see the Brown Berets. The Brown Berets became sort of what the Black Panther Party was to the Black community. And so I also want to show, if anybody's familiar with the movie Boulevard Nights, this movie was, although it was created in the mid 70s, it relates to sort of like the way things were, including in the 60s. And so some of the cars eventually went from being what are referred to as bombs to being this big body cars like the Impala, the Monte Carlo, the Cadillacs, big cars like that. And so you start to see the progression in the design of a car, but it's also the modifications that are done to the car that are also progressing. And so just like the Brown Berets were organizing, you also have student-led organizations like Mecha that started to organize in the 60s, especially around educational topics and access to education. The gangs in the neighborhoods, a lot of the low-income neighborhoods deemed as urban or like inner city, begin to organize. Places like Los Angeles, places like San Jose, places like Sacramento, Oakland, San Diego, all throughout, started to organize these large-scale gangs. And parallel to that, in a way, were the car clubs that began to organize. So the car clubs were organizations of people that were owners of lowrider cars, right? That came together under one banner, meaning the car club name, and they would cruise together, representing that car club. Some of the established car clubs at the time were the Imperial's Car Club, Techniques Car Club, Lifestyle Car Club, Click Car Club. And these car clubs were based primarily in Los Angeles and then expanded to other cities. This is really the era where the craftsmanship began to emerge, where paint jobs became a thing in the lowrider car culture, pinstriping, the wheels that were used to identify a car as a lowrider car, and definitely the beginning stages of the hydraulic system, what makes a car bounce or hop or jump. If you've ever seen a lowrider car hop, they began to do full customizations. So at this point, owning a car became a little bit more affordable. The young people were investing more into owning cars rather than just borrowing them from their parents, which allowed them to be able to customize them to the way they like them. And when the hydraulic system was invented, one story goes, and I could be wrong, if anybody has information that contradicts like what I'm saying or is more accurate than what I'm saying, I fully encourage everyone to step up and share. I won't take it personal. It actually like benefits me in the sense that I'll be better informed. But the story behind the creation of the hydraulic system, as I understood it, as has been shared to me by several people, is that the police started to implement anti-cruising laws, and one of the tactics that they used was to seek out cars that were too low, that were lower to the point that they were beyond like the factory height that they were made in. And so in order for this guy, and I don't know his name, but for him not to get a ticket for having the car too low, he started to get hydraulic parts that came from airplanes. They were I'm not sure how to refer to them, but they were from airplanes. They were hydraulic systems, pumps, cylinders that would allow like the wheels to come up and down on airplanes while they're landing. It was parts like those that were put into a car, and the cylinders that would expand that would allow the car to go up and to go down. And this again, like to not get ticketed for having a car that was too low. Um, so the hopping contest became something that they kind of engaged in when they were out on the boulevard or in the on their main streets that they cruised. They got together in parking lots and did hopping competitions. And at the time, it was referred to as potato chipping. It was almost like the cars would only hop as high as like the width of a potato chip, right? Like so it was very minimal. It was hardly any motion. Sometimes they used like beer bottles to measure how high the car would hop, if it would go, like up or above the height of a beer bottle, things like that. Um, and so yeah, so the introduction of car modification laws, anti-cruising laws became that were put into effect. And then you begin to also see the multiculturalism start to grow within the lowrider community. So what began as the subculture that was counterculture, counter to the mainstream culture that was hot rods, then became more inclusive in other subcultures that became a part of it or practiced this art form. One of these pictures is of a car referred to as Gypsy Rose. Gypsy Rose has its origins way back in the 1960s. The car was painted, and all the roses were painted by hand. That's why it's known as the Gypsy Rose. The artist that painted it did it all with brush. The car was targeted on multiple occasions. And as a result of the violence that was happening in the community, it was actually set on fire several times. And so the car now, I think it's in its third version, but it's rooted again in the influence of the very first car that was built this way, and it's now sitting in a national automotive museum, sort of like the Hall of Fame for cars, and it's the only lowrider to have made it into that museum. This is something cool to know. And so moving on to the next era. And so I'm going to be talking about the 1980s and 1990s. This is what I refer to like overcoming the warfare, specifically the gang warfare that impacted our communities in the 1980s and 90s. At this point, the lowriders had evolved, just like cars had evolved with the time, to be more affordable, to be more stylish. The variety of cars also grew. And so you also start to see different cars being, I guess, sort of incorporated into the lowrider car culture. So it went from being these big body, referred to as bomb cars and bomb trucks of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, to the big body cars of the 1960s and 70s, and the 1980s then the car manufacturers started to develop cars that were referred to as G bodies, cars like the Regal, the Monte Carlo, the Cutlass, and mini trucks. For example, this one at the top, this is what's referred to as like the radical car culture, because you're taking an import car is no longer a US based or American built car. It's now a car that's coming from overseas. It could be a Nissan, it could be a Toyota. And they were being customized with components that resembled the lowrider culture. There's also the Euros, aside from having the mini trucks and that being a part of the car culture. There's also the Euros, which could have been like Honda Civics or other imports. And you also have the traditional cars. So the 1963 Impala, all the 1960s Impalas are still very much alive in the car culture. They're still seen as the original lowrider cars. And at this point, the car clubs expanded at a national level. So it went from just being LA based or California based to then being expanded into states like Arizona, Nuevo Mexico, Texas, Colorado, including the Midwest. Places like Chicago started to become places where the car culture was popular, lowriders were popular. And then from there, it was also, well, actually, all this happened as a result of how lowriders became part of mainstream culture. So they were put in lowrider, in hip hop music videos, in movies, like Boys in the Hood, music videos, like the music videos that Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Eazy-E at the time were doing. They were featuring lowrider cars, which exposed the lowrider car culture to the bigger society, to mainstream society. And so, but at the root, it was associated with like West Coast culture, the general like street culture. The anti-cruising laws were being reinforced. I remember when I came to the United States in the mid to late 1990s, and my brother, who had a lowrider car, would take me with him to Mendocino Avenue. I remember seeing signs and the police out there trying to deter people from being out lowriding. So they became a lot more strict. Instead of just ticketing, a lot of the times they would pound the cars. They would like haul them away and confiscate them for being modified, for using, my apologies, for using the loud sound systems, the hydraulics in public, things like that. They became a lot more strict on it. And what happened too was that the gang violence that was impacting the community, communities across the southwestern United States became kind of, or were brought to the light at a national level. And so you start to see the government take steps to address the violence that was happening. And from there became they started to fund programs that would address the gang violence, but not community-based programs, but instead police strategies to address the gang problems through these gang injunctions that funded probation officers, gang task force, and other police task force that would address the violence. See, and moving on to the next one. This is kind of bringing us up to date on what the lowrider scene looks like more recently. From the 2000s on, what this car culture is going to look like is totally dependent on those that build lowrider cars and are immersed in the culture. But what we do know is that the car culture hit the international scene at this point. So you start to see cars in Germany, in Japan, Australia, Mexico, Canada, other places start to take part and participate in this car culture. And also at the same time, they start to incorporate and adopt some of the Chicano culture into their subcultures, right? And into the young people's cultures. So for example, this image recently, the Chicano movement, the Chicano culture has been highlighted in places like Japan, where similar to what the US did when we started to adopt like the style of like import cars. On the flip side, they started to like take in the Chicano culture, kind of like import it in from the United States and Mexico to Japan, and they started to embody this sense of Chicanismo. And due to the violence that happened in the 80s and 90s, the movement of the lowrider scene started to shift towards restoring the image of a lowrider, right? Restoring the sense of pride and being able to build these cars. So what went from going from like borrowing mom and dad's cars because cars weren't affordable and not easy to modify, to then starting to modify, starting to build lowriders that could hop, that could do different maneuvers with hydraulics, led into cars that could eventually hit the rear end, potentially even flip over because the hydraulic system is so powerful. But then you also start to see different components be brought into it, like the V class, the motorcycles that are designed in a similar way, like that of a lowrider car, with the paint job, with the chrome, with the leather seats that might resemble the seats inside or the interior of a car. And this lowrider game that I remember my brother got me back when I had a PlayStation 2. This is how popular it got. It got to the point where they were designing video games that were like reference the car culture. The customization again was on a whole different level. The value of the car went from being in the low thousands to then being nearly 80,000, closer to $100,000 cars. Some of these cars are more expensive than a lot of the luxury cars that are being built by big companies. And so it's all about the amount of work that's put into them, the cost of the paint jobs, the cost of the hydraulic system, amongst some of the things that add value to the car, and the historical context to them as well. And the question that I want to pose is, where will it go next, right? Because you start to see how the evolution of lowriders happened. It went from being traditional to being traditional and including the radical cars, the imports, the mini trucks, to it including motorcycles to being part of the car culture and general Chicano culture. But then the question when donks, if y'all are familiar with donks, those were popular maybe like in the late 2000s. The cars that are customized and painted and have big rims, like 26, 28-inch rims. Almost seems like a monster truck in a sense, but has the ties to what lowriders are. The question around that was like, are those considered a form of lowriders, even though they're not the traditional lowriders? Considering all the evolution that lowriders have gone through, would those be considered like the most recent version of lowriders? So that's a big debate in the community. A lot of people aren't accepting of those cars, but you can also see them and find them at lowrider like lowrider shows where people get to display their cars. And so how this all ties in to identity and stereotypes, and this sociological component of culture and identity. Through this presentation, I've been speaking about different identity terms, and I want to build that correlation to sociology. That was my major in college, and so that this is where that interest comes from. Some of the identity terms that I have brought up is the word Mexican or Mexica, right? Folks of Mexican descent. Many of them who and us who have indigenous lineage and practice indigenous traditions. Mestizos, this idea of mestizaje that's very much rooted in colonialism, that goes back to the idea of sort of like mixing with indigenous people, but perpetuating racism in a sense that what it's doing it's purposefully doing away with the indigenous identities and indigenous origins of folks, when you consider that the dominant culture, class, race in many of our central and southern or South American countries are dominated by Spanish people, by people tied to Europe. And so mestizaje again is a problematic ideology in the sense that it promotes this racist colonial approach to the way we treat people. Mexican American, Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, if you identify as Latino, Latina, Latinx. Hispanics, which references people who have direct ties to Hispania, to Spain. Chicanos, Chicanas, Chicanx, the young people who identified as Chicano. All right, thank you for showing up. The Pachucos, which the term Pachuco referenced the young people in El Paso, Texas, who would go to the border to party, and when they would say, "Hey, where are you going?" and they would say, "Vamos Pachuco," they adopted that as an identity term, Pachucos, Pachucas. And the Cholos, that's often referred to for the gang members, right? Gang affiliated folks are referred to as Cholos. And the origins of the term Cholo in Nahuatl, in indigenous language. So briefly, I just kind of want to like put this out there. Do any of these terms have positive stereotypes that you can think of? And if most of the stereotypes that come up are not positive, then what are some of the negative stereotypes that come up when you think about these identity terms? And if you also identify with these identity terms, how have those negative stereotypes impacted you? Because a lot of the times, those negative stereotypes, when we're fed them so often, so much, they become self-fulfilling prophecies. We buy into this idea that if we're called it so many times, for example, cholo, chola, so many times, and it's being constantly fed to us, then eventually we embody this sense of being a cholo, and therefore like it manifests into causing harm to our community as a result of that sense being perpetuated, right? So yeah, this is the end of my presentation. For those of you that want to stick around, I'm gonna replay the video at the beginning so that you know what we're speaking of, and hopefully now that you see this video again, then you can tie it back to what the presentation was about. So I'll play it real brief. All right, I'm gonna end the recording right there.